Hello, everyone. My name is Paula Neves, and I'm the lead for the Center for Living Organ Donation. Welcome to today's session on grief support and spiritual care. We're very glad that you're able to join us. I'm very pleased to have with us today Stefan Pankiw, and many of you will be familiar with Stefan. He's been at UHN since 2014 when he started his clinical pastoral education program at Toronto Western. He has been providing support to the transplant program at Toronto General since August of 2019. He is a spiritual care, family information and support center representative, and Stefan is also a registered psychotherapist with the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario and a registered spiritual care practitioner with the Canadian Association of Spiritual. He completed his BA at the University of Ottawa and has a Sacred Bachelors of Theology degree from St. Paul's University, also in Ottawa. Stefan was a guest on the Living Transplant podcast last year. Some of you listened to that podcast. We know that the holiday season is a very difficult time for many families. And so we wanted to bring you this conversation today about grief and grief support to build community and to address some of the questions that you may have. So I will turn it over to Stefan to take us through the presentation, and then we'll come back for a few questions right at the end. Stefan, I'll turn it over to you.
I thank you, Paula. Thank you for the introduction. It's a privilege and an honor to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. Our presentation is going to be on grief support and how spiritual care and potentially how my role fits in with this topic here at the hospital. Let's get rolling. So just a quick disclosure that I have no actual or potential conflict of interest in relation to this presentation. A few of the objectives. So first, we will learn a little bit about the theory of grief. I don't want to get too much into theory because I know we want to keep things practical and at the same time informative. So we'll discuss some signs of grief. We'll review the 4 different tasks of grieving, and then we'll talk about engaging grief and working towards healing, and then review a few online and community resources, and time for questions in the end. So I thought I would start off the presentation with start and finish with these truisms about grief and bereavement, because I think they are very important. First and foremost, grief is a normal and natural experience that can be very traumatic and very disruptive for us. It's something that we all experience. Unfortunate loss, death and dying is a part of our human existence and experience, and we all have to process it in some way. There's no timetable around grief. There's definitely no right way of doing it. I would say there is a wrong way of doing it. The last point here, the goal is to grieve well and not grieve right. So there's a healthy way of doing it. And those are some of the things that we will talk about in the presentation. And there are a few different templates and ways of formulating the process of grief. We'll talk through a couple of them, but they are just, I would refer to them as loose guidelines. So when someone you love dies, your emotions, your health, social life, and spiritual well-being can change. We're often left in this state of shock, of numbness and disbelief. There is, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, I think that there are different aspects of loss. We can experience it in many different ways in our life. Through this presentation, though, I think that I will be focusing on the death and dying part. I would say probably the harder parts of the grief process. So just to make a quick distinction, that grief occurs after any loss. There are definitely different types of losses that we can experience. It can be a physical loss. It can be something related to our body image. It can be an emotional loss. It could be a sense of security, maybe a crisis of faith. That can be a significant loss that we experience. The way things used to be going over in our minds time and time again. Social and relational losses. And that's really where the death and dying comes in, where our relational stance with the person changes. And also financial losses is one other type of loss. I thought I would also mention a couple of different dimensions of grief. First is the anticipatory grief, and that happens when we're in a state of, in a way, vigil, where again, when it comes to death and dying, it's when somebody is approaching the end of their life. And in some ways, you begin that grieving process preemptively, even before that actual death occurs. And that's a normal process. I think, practically speaking, the example I like to use is anticipatory grief is very, very present for folks and for families that have a loved one that's diagnosed with dementia. And in some ways, you begin that grieving process as you start to lose bits and pieces of your loved one. So it can be very challenging. And then the other dimension of grief is the prolonged grief. And I want to focus quite a bit more on this one, where it used to be known as complicated grief. And that's where it can potentially become, it's very unhealthy, and unhealthy behaviors can develop. Definitely needs attention. We'll go through some of the emotions and some of the different feelings that you might potentially be feeling if you're in this prolonged state of grief, and then talk about some of the ways of resolve for it. I like to use a analogy with folks around grief that some of the lesser losses in our lives, they're like little paper cuts or little cuts that we get on a daily or weekly time frame. But then I want you to imagine you're standing in your kitchen and chopping vegetables, something that you do on a regular basis, and you accidentally cut your hand. And you look down on your hand and it's very painful and it hurts quite a bit. You're not really sure what to do. In some ways, you're even angry. Why did this happen? I've been doing this for many years, and how did I just cut myself so badly? And eventually, you get it together. You sit down, you put some ice on it, you cover it up with some Band-Aids, and it stops to bleed. And then eventually the feeling starts to change and it starts to itch and not hurt anymore. And a couple days goes by, walk by a table and you accidentally bang your hand on the side of the table and the wound bursts open all over again. And that wound is like our grief. That's the analogy that I like to use, because it can come, and then all of those feelings that you felt in that moment when you were chopping your vegetables, it all comes flying back. That feeling of hurt and pain and kind of frustration. How did this happen again? Why did I bang my hand on the table again? And time and again, you will hit your hand on the table and it will need to start to rescar and rescab, but it will heal. And every time you look down in your hand, you'll be reminded of those emotions that you felt. The healing within grief, it's not that straightforward as it would be in a physical way. But now, to jump into the complicated or prolonged sense of grief, now imagine that wound actually doesn't heal. And imagine that it unfortunately continues to hurt really bad. So what do you do? What do you do in a situation like that? You seek medical attention, right? You go to the doctor, you get stitches, you get maybe a prescription for something, and you seek help. And it's the same thing with grief. If you find yourself in this prolonged state of grief, feeling some of these really intense emotions, there is definitely a need for you to reach out and seek some support. So why is grieving important? Well, grieving is important because, as I mentioned, it's a natural part of life. We need to recognize that. And moving through it, we need to acknowledge that. How do we move through it? We mourn. And when we mourn, it's when we feel that sense of healing become a reality. I mentioned already that in my analogy that it's not as straightforward as a physical healing, but there are similarities. There are some things that you can control. There are ways of being intentional about addressing your grief, as there are ways of being intentional, ways of addressing your physical health. So while there's differences, there's also a lot of similarities. And the working of grieving brings us to a new state of psychological, emotional, and spiritual equilibrium. While this process it can be very painful, very long, very trying, it's worth it in the end. I've mentioned some of these things already, that everyone grieves in their own pace. That's important to acknowledge. Sometimes we see folks that even loved ones where we have this assumption around, why aren't you grieving this way or that way? And there's a sense of judgment, or even from on the other side of it, this sense of guilt. Why am I not feeling that way? There is no written formula of what's right and wrong in those situations. And I recognize that there can be many different folks listening in on this talk, and some of you from the Living Donor Program that have given organs or received organs, and it can get very complicated, especially complicated and complex. I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit further in the conversation and in the presentation too. So these are some feelings I thought that I would list that are normal and natural feelings that you would get when we're feeling a sense of loss. Sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety. It can be one of these things. It can be many of these things at once. And it can be actually, sometimes when I engage with folks that are grieving, it's confusing, and it takes some time to sort through some of these emotions. But it's good to acknowledge that you are feeling them. That's where I think it all begins, acknowledgement. These are some other common symptoms of grief. There are physical ramifications of it. And these are, again, common, yet at the same time, normal and natural symptoms of the grief. So this is where I want to unpack prolonged and complicated grief a little bit more. It's important to note that it occurs when we, among all the other things that I've mentioned about it, it occurs when we feel we're stuck. And while there are many other aspects of life where we can feel stuck, this is something that can have very negative and very serious consequences in our life and needs to be addressed. So these are, again, I listed some of the signs that you need to be mindful of and aware of. Insomnia, loss of appetite, weight loss or weight gain rapidly, constant fatigue. These are all kind of red flags that you should be mindful to try and seek some help. So what can you do? I'm not going to read all of these because there are so many, and each one I think can be unpacked individually, but I just thought that I would include them here. How can you stay, in some ways, how can you stay clear of prolonged grief? What can you do to avoid this complicated grief? And part of the answer, I think, is mourning. I came across this website, Center for Loss. I listed the website here, and I took this quote out of it, that mourning means to express your grief outside of yourself. Mourning is crying, talking to other people about the death, sharing stories, putting together photo albums, journaling, and other actions. Mourning is essential because it's through mourning that you begin to heal. And I really appreciate the 6 needs that are listed there. The first one being acknowledgement. There's such a huge, and I mentioned that before, that acknowledging the reality of the loss, of the death, is the first step. It's step one, and it might seem like common sense, but emotionally it's very difficult to do. The second step is embracing the pain of death, of the loss, that this is happening, and making it a reality for yourself. The third aspect is remembering the person who died. I'll talk a lot more about that towards the end of the presentation. How can you honor that person? Through that, I think you can develop a new sense of self-identity. And that's a very spiritual exercise, that you start to begin to search for the meaning in the whole thing. It's very challenging to do. And I want to, again, just highlight the fact that none of this is done very quickly. This is a very long and reflective process that takes quite a bit of time to work through. And then the last need of mourning that this website mentions, it's receiving ongoing support from others. So it's the ability to be open to the support and not sitting with it alone. I absolutely love this quote, that the natural journey of mourning involves a struggle between the need to evade the pain of the loss and encounter the pain of the loss. As hard as it is, there's so much strength in vulnerability. There's so much strength in being honest with yourself and facing some of these intense emotions head on. Because, like I said, and I'll probably say this a few more times throughout this presentation, that as hard as this work is to work through some of these intense emotions, it's definitely worth it in the end. I wanted to highlight 4 more tasks of grieving. So these are in some ways a similar approach to the 6 needs of mourning, the 6 needs of grieving. And the first one, as it says here, that these 2 can be applied to pretty much all losses, not necessarily defined by a death, that we need to accept the reality of the loss and we need to engage the pain of the grief. And then the following 2 are specific for the grief that occurs around death and dying. And there's number 3 is to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. So how do we move on with life? As hard as that is to say, but how do we continue to live? How do we continue to have fun? And that's done within the last number 4, to emotionally relocate the deceased person and re-engage life. So why do we need to engage the pain of grief? Because we need that experience to be able to build resilience within ourselves. Unfortunately, I mentioned right at the beginning that grief is something we all face and will face. And I think that it's only with this level of openness and willingness to talk about it, be vulnerable, that you will build resiliency and be able to grieve in a healthy way. How do we do that? I think that is very much grounded in and begins with building the capacity to have the self-awareness, to have an open heart for the acceptance is what we want to focus on. The loss that happened, this I think is very important to note, especially for folks in the living donor program, that things that happen and the outcomes are not within our control. I think it's very natural and normal for our emotional selves to go there, to go to that almost scary place of guilt and worry and what ifs. But it's very important to remind yourself that the whole aspect of control in situations like this isn't real. We have to be responsible for ourselves, for our responses to what's happening, and not be reactive and not focused on the outcomes. Again, for folks in the living donor program, to redefine the moment and try to appreciate that it's still such a gift that you have given. It's still such a blessing. It's still such an act of charity that you have shared a piece of yourself with someone else. And the outcomes, again, are not within our control. It's of course a collaborative measure to see what the outcomes are. At the same time, sometimes things just don't work out the way we hope them to. And that's very difficult. I just wanted to acknowledge that it's very challenging. To arrive at a place of acceptance, though, one must face their feelings and acknowledging that, as I said, guilt is sometimes a part of that. So what are some coping strategies for grief and loss? There are definitely a lot. There's so much that can potentially be unpacked here. So I want to focus on a couple of them. First and foremost, if you have a community, if you have a faith community, again, being a spiritual care practitioner, if there's a spirituality that works for you, try to see how that can work for you. Try to see how you can use it to help you along this process and engaging in the experience of the grief. And what I mean by that is the openness and willingness to talk about it, to write about it, to reflect about it. And this can be done through so many different mediums. The support groups are such a wonderful place to do that. You get a chance to journey with folks that are going through something similar. And at the same time, there could be folks that have already journeyed through a similar experience, or even talking about death with family and friends. Again, being open to the support. You don't want to fall into a place of isolation that will 100% lead into prolonged grief and complicated grief. And that's, again, as mentioned, it's not a healthy place to. Practically speaking, there are something that I've heard folks talk about, planting a tree in your loved one's name. That can be a way for you to feel like they're continuing to live on. And another little example I like to use with folks around when a death occurs, that yes, your loved one has left a gaping hole in your heart. Now you have this opportunity to fill your heart with something, to fill your heart with love, with beautiful memories of that person. As I said, many different ways to do that. Staying involved with your community. The things that are routine for you, I would encourage you to stay on top of them, whether it's going for a run or being intentional about some other means of exercise. Continue to do that. Those are so important to stay within your routine, because that's the normal part of your life. The loss, potentially the grief, is the not normal part. So we need some kind of anchor to help carry us through. And it might seem like a silly thing, but it's not. It's actually very important to rely on that routine. I also want to mention that it's okay not to talk about it. I don't think that anybody should feel like they're ever put on the spot and forced to talk about their loved one or their grief. If you don't feel ready, then respectfully say, I don't think I'm ready to engage at this point. That's definitely okay too. It's part of that, having that openness for yourself and readiness and willingness to engage when you are ready. I've mentioned this already. Don't be afraid to laugh and enjoy life. It can be difficult. And again, laughter and a joyous moment can potentially very quickly lead to a sense of guilt. I am laughing while my loved one has died and is no longer able to laugh. But joy and laughter is such an important part of life. And I think the loved one would want you to continue to live and to laugh and to love. So remember, bringing that to mind, it's helpful, can be very helpful. I now want to review those truisms that I mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation about grief and bereavement, that it's natural and normal, that it can be a response to a variety of different losses, that there are no timelines around what this process should look like. Grief can hit you. That wound can burst open in a day. It can burst open in a week or two. There's no formal, orderly fashion of what the process looks like. And to keep in mind that you should aim to grieve well and not right. You don't have to do it alone. I'm sorry to jump back here. Please remember that it can feel very isolating, those intense feelings, and something that, again, I say to folks, nobody can ever know exactly what you're going through. Nobody ever knows what sadness is like for you. So it might not be helpful to hear, I know what you're going through, from somebody else. But there have been multiple people, as I said, all of us have gone through grief, that have journeyed on this path in their own way. So please, if you're feeling alone, there are ways of reaching out to folks and forming that sense of community and relationship. I thought I'd also include a couple of quick strategies for folks that are perhaps journeying with folks that are grieving. These are very simple in a way, but offering a listening presence. I think that presence plays such a key role. Oftentimes in families, we don't really appreciate, in the full sense of the word, of the impact of presence that we have in each other's lives. It's amazing how what those impacts can be. The other points here, if lost by death, use the name of the person who died. So to be, in a way, practical, but also intentional about making sure that the acceptance piece is actually moving in the right direction. And by using the person's name helps that. And this last point here, I think, is really crucial. We oftentimes, our natural human tendency when we're faced with challenging situations, and grief included, is we want to fix, we want to give advice, we want to give our kind of 2 cents. And we seldomly should. Oftentimes, folks, what they want from us is our presence, is a listening ear, is the ability to express what they have. When we, again, naturally jump in and try to provide solutions and steer folks in a direction, in some ways that can potentially take away from what they're feeling. So consciously, I would invite and encourage folks that are journeying with folks that are grieving to not perhaps give advice or be judging, welcoming their experience of grief. So here are some online resources that are available to you. I know that there's a whole lot of resources out in the communities and online and potentially hard to sift through. I can tell you, if there are folks that are within the UHN, that are within the system, that we do have social workers, myself, spiritual care folks. We do have a psychosocial and psychiatry team that is here. And the way to get in touch with any of us for spiritual care, I can say that just ask your nurse, ask whoever your practitioner is to page us through locating, and they will know exactly how to get a hold of us and how to reach out. We're here every single day of the year, 8:30 to 11 at night, and ready and willing to support folks. Another thing that spiritual care does on a biannual basis is our service of remembrance. And if you lose a loved one that's at UHN, that we send out this invitation to you. And right now, because of COVID, it's all virtual. So there is a link that's sent out, and it is a pre-recorded service and ceremony. So you can view it at your own leisure, but it can be helpful for a sense of closure as well. And I think that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Stefan. That was a very important presentation, I think, for our audience. Transplant is bittersweet in many ways. It is life-saving for those that rely on deceased organ donation. It involves grief and loss for donor families, and very important for us to acknowledge. And certainly for those involved in living organ donation, we know that in the vast majority of cases, the outcomes are excellent, but for some, the recipient passes away. And so that can be very difficult for living donors, and we know that they struggle. And I'm wondering, on that note, Stefan, if you can talk a little bit about what you've seen from a practice perspective as you've visited with transplant patients, transplant families, living donors. What are you seeing in terms of how they're feeling, and just remind us a little bit more about things that may be helpful in this time.
Thanks, Paulo. My experience, I have to be honest, is rather limited in those circumstances, but I can definitely speak to the instances that I have gone through. I think that a lot of the aspects of grief are very present in those situations. That sense of guilt, ownership, naturally speaking, are very present. And it's very challenging. It's complex grief. And you're feeling a lot of different losses at the same time. Hard to make sense out of it. That's why, as I mentioned, trying to be patient and knowing, trusting in the system, trusting that it does take time for potential healing to take place. One person that I spoke to, what you're saying, the living donor recipient died. It happened years and years after the operation, and the death occurred because of something completely different. Yet there was still this sense of profound sadness and profound loss that the donor was feeling, and ownership. There's no I wish there was an easier way to swim through that river of grief, but there unfortunately isn't. I think that, again, just being mindful that we are responsible and in control of ourselves, and bringing ourselves back to reflecting in that we take part in this program with 100% the best of intentions. There's always that aspect of this being an act of love. And at some point, there needs to be that recognition. Putting your emotional stop at that is enough. that this was an act of love. It's very challenging in life in general when outcomes don't align with our expectations. And this is, I think, as heightened of an example where that doesn't align as can possibly your intention is to save a person's life and the reverse happens. And of course, that's hard. Of course, that's sad. And of course, there will be a sense of ownership. But I can only encourage folks, please don't sit with that on your own. Please talk to somebody about that, right from your family members to your friends, but also us here at the hospital. If that's happening in real time, it's okay not to be able to handle it. I don't think anybody in their right mind would be able to handle it, frankly said, because it's very challenging. You're bombarded with all these emotions and logistically, physically, emotionally, spiritually, so many questions that come up that it's hard to sift through. So just please don't feel like you're alone. That's all that would be my suggestion to folks, not to sit with it on their own.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. I think really important words. And you talked about prolonged grief, complicated grief, and the feeling being stuck. And I'm wondering, how do you know if you're stuck? How do you know if this is normal, natural, or this is something that really requires potentially counseling or additional external support?
Well, excellent question. I think it's a very fine balance. It is a very fine balance and it's different for everybody, obviously. When you start to feel like things aren't manageable, obviously, I didn't really touch on some of the more acute mental health crises that folks face. If anybody ever feels they want to engage in self-harm or harm to others, they definitely should reach out to a healthcare provider, go to the nearest emergency room. That's a given across the board. I think it becomes prolonged grief when it's affecting your life in a very drastic way. So like I mentioned, some of the symptoms around insomnia, weight gain, weight loss, if it's persistently happening for an extended period of time. So if you can't sleep for a week straight or you're having nightmares or night terrors, you need to reach out to somebody. If you've gained 20 pounds or lost 20 pounds in 2 weeks, you need to talk to somebody, because then that's not your coping mechanisms that you've developed in your life aren't helping you and aren't serving you. Those types of things. It is a very fine balance, because on one hand, I realize that I'm saying it's a process and it takes time for us to heal and to get to engage in mourning. Another big red flag that I would say on that note is denial. When you can't, we have to be mindful that our logical self and our emotional self are at two different levels when it comes to grief and loss. It's normal and natural for the emotional self to be playing catch up, to be taking its sweet time, but the logical part needs to be there. It needs to recognize and realize that this has happened. What do I do? How do I heal? And if that's not happening, if your mind isn't able to absorb the reality of that loss, then that's a major red flag that you're going down the road of prolonged grief.
Mm-hmm. And on the other side of this, I also hear sometimes from folks who are coming out of the grief process and feeling guilty about it, feeling like it hasn't been enough time, or others perhaps suggesting that there might be an expected time to grieve, a certain way of grieving. You did mention that there's no one right way to grieve, but talk us through the various ways that people grieve, and how to accept our own journey as unique and right for us.
I think that when we start to feel that sense of judgment from those around us, it's important to realize and recognize that they're probably grieving too. And part of them having that sense of judgment is their way of expressing their grief. And perhaps it's their inability to cope and their way of trying to maintain control of the situation. And I think that we are experts in our own story. We are experts in our own body and our own emotions, hopefully. And we can only judge that within ourselves when we know that things are going okay or things are not going okay. We need to remind ourselves again, time and again, that I need to be responsible for myself. If somebody isn't able to cope, all you can do, the couple things that I mentioned towards the end there, offer them a space of openness and space to a listening presence, as I said. That's very important for those folks. How do you know that you're on the right path? I think that when you are able to continue to function within a relatively, again, it's very difficult for me to give a formulation here that this is right, this is wrong. But when you are able to take care of yourself, oftentimes here at the hospital dealing with death and dying, I'll say to family members, make sure that you eat, make sure that you sleep, make sure that you're staying safe, make sure that you have someone you can call. Those are all things that that are acutely sprung on us when it just happens. But within a few days, within a reasonable sort of time, those things will start to look different and the grief will start to, you should feel some type of shift that happens within you, again, within a reasonable amount of time.
I think we've reached the end of our time. I know that this is a complex topic and we may come back to it in the future. So to those of you watching today, please let us know if there are other related topics that you'd like us to address in future iterations of these webinars. We would also love to have Stefan back again to talk to you and potentially to have a live session. So before we sign off, perhaps, Stefan, I can ask you to say a few closing words to our audience.
Thanks, Paula. Well, I wanted to share with everyone a poem by John O'Donohue from his book, To Bless the Space Between Us, and it's titled For Grief. When you lose someone you love, your life becomes strange. The ground beneath you gets fragile. Your thoughts make your eyes unsure, and some dead echo drags your voice down where words have no confidence. Your heart has grown heavy with loss, and though this loss has wounded others too, no one knows what has been taken from you. When the silence of absence deepens, flickers of guilt kindle regret for all that was left unsaid or undone. There are days when you wake up happy, again inside the fullness of life, until the moment breaks and you are thrown back onto the black tide of loss. Days when you have your heart back, you're able to function well until in the middle of work or encounter, suddenly with no warning, you're ambushed by grief. It becomes hard to trust yourself. All you can deepen on is that sorrow will remain faithful to itself, more than it knows its way, and will find the right time to pull the rope of grief until that coiled hill of tears has reduced to its last drop. Gradually, you'll learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed, and when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from that gap in the air and to be able to enter the hearth of your soul, where your loved one has awaited your return all the time. Thank you once again, Paula, for this opportunity to talk about grief.
And thank you very much, Stefan, for your knowledge and those beautiful words. We hope you find comfort in those words during this time. And we look forward to seeing you again in January when we relaunch our webinar series. Thank you for joining us.